Heyo, busy brain. Welcome to the Busy Brained Saint podcast, where faith meets focus. I'm Camden Hainsworth, an expert ADHD coach, here to help you understand your mind with confidence. God knows your brain perfectly, so let's explore that divine design together and discover just how fulfilling your life can be, living with God and ADHD. Hey, ADHDer, I'm so grateful that you have chosen this podcast today. Thanks for being here. You've probably had these moments in your life where the same ADHD situation continuously creeps up. And no matter how many different angles you go about trying to conquer this symptom or this struggle, it just seems to be failure time and time again. Sometimes what you just need is a second view, a different view, a non-biased view. There's a really common phrase in the coaching world that says you can't see the outside of the label from inside of the bottle. And that's precisely what ADHD coaching does, is it allows me, as somebody who understands the ADHD brain, who's really got an attuned ear to help people, I can listen to your situation, listen to your struggle, and hear it in a different way. And I'd love to be able to do that for you. I have 20-minute free coaching sessions. I call them my mini sessions. And if you don't know if a whole coaching package is exactly what you want to sign up for, or if you are interested in learning more about my coaching, these free mini sessions are there for you. So highly recommend CamdenADHDcoaching.com, and you'll click on mini session, and then we can get together. And just in that 20 minutes or so, I promise I'm going to send you a whole different perspective on how to approach this. I know that I've at least helped you in some way to get a hold of yourself with ADHD. So once again, CamdenADHDcoaching.com, click on free mini session, and I hope to see you very, very soon. Now into the podcast. Hello, you made it. I'm so happy that you are here. My brain is busy and my heart is full. Today's podcast episode is titled The Hardest Questions I'm Asked as an ADHD Coach. And this is not actually what you think it might be. As ADHD coaches, people bring to me and to my colleagues a lot of really difficult questions. And what's really interesting is those questions, the hard ones that you're thinking of, the ones that might be based upon your traumas or your insecurities, questions that are based in maybe sadness or things that you don't feel proud of, those are the things that we love. Those are not the harder questions. The harder questions are the most basic ones. Because in my situation, my brain doesn't have a photographic memory. And all throughout school, in history classes and math classes and anything that required specificity to the content, it was never my forte. So these are the questions that when I get asked should be, you would assume to be the most simple because they're the most basic, and essentially you just have to regenerate the response. But these are the ones that make me shiver because I stumble over my words, because precision of language is not my forte. And then remembering particular details and percentages and resources are also not something that I'm naturally gifted in. Thank goodness I still can get through it, but I thought it would be fun to at least do a podcast where I answer all of those questions that are pretty essential to understanding ADHD without the pressure of being interviewed or having to come up with them in the moment. So this is a really great episode. It's going to really dive into ADHD 101 with, once again, the hardest questions I've ever been asked, which are just pretty much important information for you to know. So we're going to start out with the absolute favorite. What is ADHD? And ADHD stands for Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. It's a neurodevelopmental condition that affects attention, regulation, impulse control, motivation, and emotional regulation. It's not a lack of attention, but a difficulty regulating where attention goes and how it is sustained. ADHD is linked to differences in brain networks involved in executive functioning and dopamine regulation. And you can learn more about that for the Centers of Disease Control and Prevention and the National Institute of Mental Health. It is the DSM-5 has a whole criteria that is used to diagnose ADHD, What's really interesting, however, about ADHD is that the diagnostic criteria for children is the same one that is used for adults. And so it gets a little bit tricky because adults most of the time are no longer in school. They're no longer having to, quote unquote, stay in their seats the same way that a kid in school might have been. Also, I believe the age is 12, and I think that we will get to this later. But in order to be diagnosed with ADHD, the symptoms of ADHD had to have been prevalent before age 12 in addition to in adulthood. And that can be tricky sometimes as an adult if we don't have a whole ton of evidence, specific evidence and report cards, etc. Thankfully for me, my practitioners took my word for it, and we just talked about my experience growing up in school as an adolescent. And that was really helpful. Okay. It's like the hardest one. Okay, on to number 2. What are executive functions? As we understand, ADHD impacts the prefrontal cortex, which is in charge of all the executive functions. And remembering this on the spot is just, I need to write a song and then I'll be able to remember all of them. But the executive functions are the brain's self-management system, primarily supported by the prefrontal cortex, like I said. They help you plan, start, stop, prioritize, and regulate behavior and emotion. Key components include working memory, cognitive flexibility, and inhibitory control. And I'm just going to go ahead and look up, I had some other notes that some people say that there are like 7 executive functions. Other people say otherwise. Regardless, I'm going to go ahead and bring up something. Okay, attention inhibition, goal setting, organizing, cognitive flexibility, working memory, and self-monitoring are some of the executive functions. How many was that? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So that was 6. Here's another model that has 8. Time management, self-control, self-monitoring, emotional control, flexibility, task initiation, organization, working memory, and time management. So there's another model with 8. So it depends on who you're talking to. And I have had a podcast specifically about this. So you can go ahead and check that one out. But executive functions are a massive part of ADHD. And the prefrontal cortex, which is sometimes said as underdeveloped. I like to think of it as different developed. Our prefrontal cortex is like a different maze. And that's what that definition above said. It's the brain networks that differ from a neurotypical brain in addition to dopamine regulation. And a lot of medications will press emphasis on increasing neurotransmitters such as dopamine. And so people think, oh, ADHD will just be fixed if there's higher dopamine levels. That's too simplified and it's not actually accurate. The uptake of dopamine, how dopamine is utilized and synthesized, how much dopamine is produced, in addition to the brain networks themselves, are different. Okay. What are the symptoms of ADHD? According to the DSM-5, inattention is one of the main subcategories. And under inattention, we have distractibility, forgetfulness, disorganization. Then we have hyperactivity/impulsivity, which is a second part. So we can have ADHD inattentive, which is what I just said. And then ADHD hyperactive/ADHD like impulsive. They just usually say hyperactive, which is restlessness, interrupting, making impulsive decisions, or it can be combined, any list of those. It needs to persist for at least 6 months and be present, like I said, before the age of 12. And it needs to be impaired not just in one situation, but in multiple scenarios. So not just home life, but home and school life. Not just work life, but work life, home life. So it needs to be seen in a variety of situations. And you can just look up the DSM-5 and the American Psychiatric Association will have that information. I'm just so laughing because there is no way. I can usually remember 1 or 2 of these things or the main ideas, but to give specific definitions, Okay, what does ADHD look like in women compared to men? Also, it shouldn't be a hard question, but I want to make sure that all the information is there. I usually say that women, generally speaking, are more of the inattentive type. However, I have close friends and family members who are female who also have ADHD, hyperactive. A lot of the time, women have internalized ADHD and hyperactivity if they have it, and it comes across as being inattentive. So their brain is really fast and they're in their own little la land. They're in their own little world. And on the outside, they look like they're paying attention. They're masking, they're nodding their head, they're smiling, but upstairs, they're not at all processing what's right in front of them. Many of my clients have been diagnosed first with anxiety to discover that anxiety medication didn't help them. But when they're diagnosed with ADHD and they're given ADHD medication, it decreased their anxiety. And so anxiety can come from a lack of regulation in the prefrontal cortex with someone with ADHD, and that's really prevalent within women. Emotional sensitivity is really high, something called rejection sensitivity dysphoria, and just rejection sensitivity and emotional sensitivity is really high. So when a range of quote unquote normal emotions might have a smaller scale, we tend to go a lot lower with our emotion and a lot higher with our emotions. This might also look like perfectionism, and within the religious community could look like scrupulosity, that religious, almost OCD type of feeling where you have to obey, you have to do in order to make things be appropriate and right and acceptable. Perfectionism is not the same thing as OCD, though. Let me go ahead and put that out there. Overfunctioning, burning out, spreading yourself too thin. All of these can be massive symptoms of someone who is diagnosed with ADHD, who is also a woman. So lots of people, specifically women, have been misdiagnosed for years a lot of the time, where they just think, oh, this is what it means to be a mom or just to be well-rounded. It's just like you have to be stressed out. And later to understand that's actually been mislabeled and that they have a different brain type that doesn't manage doesn't manage the stress executive functions in the same way. And so they've had to live with a lot of that stress. Okay, ADHD in women versus men. So on the other hand, men are more likely to show those externalized symptoms, hyperactivity and impulsivity, leading to an earlier diagnosis most of the time. These are those boys in the back of the class that are bouncing off the walls in elementary school. If women have more internalized symptoms of ADHD, then men and boys have more externalized. It's just a lot more clear. And obviously social expectations and how the structures and the systems that they grow up in are organized, what those expectations are, will reveal a lot more of these behaviors more easily. Okay, what medications are used for ADHD and how do they work? So I usually talk about stimulants and non-stimulants, and they work differently. Even for my own diagnosis, I ended up having to go through about 8 different medications. And on the 9th one is when I found one that worked. And then within that medication, finding the right dosage was really a big deal. So some of the most common stimulants out there are Adderall and Ritalin. Some of the more traditional non-stimulants would be something like Strattera. And the medications help improve focus, impulse control, and task initiation. But there's not like a cure to ADHD. And when I talk about medication, I like to talk about skateboarding and how when I'm on a skateboard that has really wobbly trucks and needs to tighten up that nut on the truck to make it tighter, medication is tightening up my truck so that when I'm going down hills and I'm skating, I don't feel so wobbly on my deck. And without medication, it's not that I can't skateboard, it's just that it feels more wobbly and I'm having to use my core muscles a lot more to make up for what the trucks aren't providing me. Okay, how is ADHD diagnosed? ADHD is diagnosed using criteria from the DSM-5, If you have a child, you can go to the pediatrician, or you can go to a child psychologist or a psychiatrist, and they can help you with that. Many people that are wanting to pursue diagnosis are often finding, especially in adulthood, that the hacks and the workarounds and hard work is not actually paying off, that things continue to fall through the cracks regardless of how much effort they're putting in. And it starts to become really frustrating. And in fact, most people, when they start to get to that point, they feel like it's starting to get in the way of their life satisfaction. These are persistent symptoms. While they might fluctuate somewhat in intensity, they are pretty persistent over time. And that's why I say that when you look back on your childhood, if you can remember that, with these particular symptoms seen in the DSM-5, you can most definitely see them in your adolescence in addition to your adulthood. And impairment isn't just in one part of your life. We talked about it being in different settings, but in addition to that, the impairment is not just in one aspect of your life. So every time I'm out in social situations, this happens, but not in others. Or in other words, you need to have not just one part of the DSM-5 that you're finding these symptoms. There are people that struggle with executive dysfunction who don't necessarily have ADHD. There are people that struggle with focus who don't necessarily have ADHD. They might have PTSD or OCD, where other things are drawing their attention for other reasons. And getting diagnosed with ADHD means that you have a significant amount of the symptoms in the diagnostic criteria for ADHD. I hope I described that okay. So once again, the 3 types of ADHD are inattentive type, hyperactive/impulsive type, or the combined type. And that all comes out once you've taken that evaluation. Some evaluations are just going to be by talking. Other more in-depth ones will be by taking a variety of different tests, and those can be done with a specialist as well. Okay, what is the impact of hormones on ADHD? ADHD symptoms are influenced by dopamine regulation, which we talked about earlier, and dopamine is highly impacted by estrogen levels. So this is the part I always have to look up, but the higher the estrogen level, the improves the dopamine function, and therefore your symptoms are more in control. When estrogen drops and you have lower estrogen levels, there's reduced dopamine activity, and therefore your symptoms increase. That's why for a lot of women with menstrual cycles in that luteal phase, when estrogen drops significantly, we start to feel a little bit disconnected in our heads. For me, that often comes massively with word recall. I can't remember the words. I'm just grasping. My sentences don't flow together very well. I just don't feel as connected to my mind and my thoughts, and the words don't fly off my tongue as they usually do. And then, of course, in perimenopause and menopause and postpartum, when our hormones are really fluctuating and less predictable patterns, that can be really frustrating as well. Okay, you can look at National Institutes of Health as well as Office on Women's Health for some great articles there. I think I also saw Chad just did an article. If you follow on Instagram, Sophie, she has an Instagram channel called The ADHD Cycle that also teaches a lot about that. Okay, what percentage of people have ADHD? I don't remember this. I always want to say 1 in 10, but estimates suggest 5 to 7% of children, 3 to 4% of adults. And based upon this one, that equally is roughly 1 in 20 people worldwide. And this just depends on which book you're reading at which time and what the most up-to-date information is. It's probably, I remember it being even higher than this source. This source is taken from Chad, but regardless, if you think between 1 in 10 and 1 in 20, it's still pretty high. So that's at least 1 to 2 kids in a school classroom. And I'm feeling like it's a lot higher these days as well. One of the interesting things that I was also reading in National Geographic, which is not like a reputable source for medical journals, but they did have great citations within the magazine that I was reading, is this idea that when we're putting tablets and devices right in front of these little babies' faces and toddlers, their brain is learning to evolve based upon how quickly these pictures are changing. And so it's programming their brain to have a shorter attention span. And that's not necessarily ADHD, but the symptoms show the very similar symptoms as ADHD. So I wonder what kind of impact that's also going to have on the rising generation as well. And not just toddlers, but kids in general. Do you think that ADHD is good or bad? Do you see this as a superpower or a detriment? That's our number 10 question here. And I just don't see it as inherently good or bad. I just see it as information. Understanding that compartment itself is helpful information for me to understand about what I'm experiencing so that I can live in more truth and I can take that and then do something with it. I do believe that we can self-suggest to a degree to our subconscious and saying, yes, I have ADHD, and then stopping there can become detrimental. I have seen that as I've been in this work, I see life through an ADHD lens. And sometimes I feel like that might create a little bit more drama for me. But having said that, the knowledge of knowing I have an ADHD brain has far outweighed not knowing. And that doesn't really answer the question. It just helps me know that I have a neurological difference that's unique from my husband, from people that I work around, and it helps me have more grace and understanding for myself. It also helps me advocate for myself better. And ADHD presents some real challenges, real life things, hence why I have a very successful and thriving business as an ADHD coach, is because we don't learn how to manage our brain in general, let alone a brain that's different than the expectations of neurotypical society. And yeah, there's massive challenges with ADHD, but those challenges don't have to be a life sentence of failure. They are just information so that we can learn how to do things in a way that utilizes the strengths of our brain. Those challenges, just like the reason why I'm doing this podcast, results in executive functioning, but it also can come with beautiful strengths like creativity, pattern recognition, intensity, and hyperfocus. And I think that the outcomes of having an ADHD brain really depend heavily upon the environment and support systems, understanding yourself, as well as skills and scaffolding that you might be able to have for you or a loved one. Once again, the reason why I wanted to do this podcast and what seems to be a lot of simple answers is because these are the answers that are so basic, but so specific that my highly creative and pattern recognition brain is less interested in remembering. And that doesn't mean I don't know it. It doesn't mean I don't think it's important. But when we talk about the strengths of pattern recognition and hyperfocus and application to things that we really care about, that's what makes me a really good coach, is because as I'm listening to you, I am taking in everything you're saying and I'm putting together possible puzzles to reveal to you to then help illuminate ideas for how you would like to progress in your life or things that you might want to consider as you're looking to improve your life with an ADHD brain. And that's what's really where I feel like the masterpiece is, that in that challenge, in the quote unquote hard work, the deep work, it actually feels easier in some ways because I'm tapping into my strengths and it's pushing me and challenging me in my strengths instead of challenging me in my weaknesses. And I just feel so thankful and grateful that I get to have a profession where I can come on here and be honest about my weaknesses and my strengths, and that it doesn't matter. So some of my favorite books about ADHD, one of them is Taking Charge of Adult ADHD with Russell Barkley, of which I took many of this information from. Another one I like is ADHD 2.0 by Dr. Hallowell and Dr. Rady. Another one I like is Your Brain's Not Broken by Tamara Rosier, I think is her name. And if you would like any more book recommendations, you can go to CamdenADHDcoaching.com/books. And there I have put into some subheadings based upon your needs and what kind of reading style you would like to give you some great resources. Thank you so much for being with me today. I hope that this was a bite-sized look at the questions that I hate the most. Not because they're not important, but they just require me to flex some muscles that are harder for my particular flavor of ADHD. Thanks for being here. Know how much I love you, and I'm always cheering you on. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of the Busy Brained Saint podcast. If you're eager to explore the world of ADHD coaching, make sure to connect with me on Instagram at Camden_ADHD or visit my website, CamdenADHDcoaching.com. For more LDS-specific ADHD content, don't forget to follow this podcast and join us on Instagram at The Busy Brained Saint. Listen, I'm here to support you on your journey. I cannot wait to have you as a part of our community. Stay engaged, stay inspired, and remember, you're not alone here. Thanks for being a part of the Busy Brained Saint family.